Ambassador Kethavar stepped out of his small transport ship and onto the metal floor of Research Station Omega-7. The station hung in the darkness of space like a giant metal spider, its arms reaching out in all directions. Cold air filled his lungs as he breathed in the recycled atmosphere that tasted of metal and cleaning chemicals. The Zephyrian diplomat had been to many stations before, but this one felt different. Something about the place made his skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the lights flickered in the long hallways, or maybe it was how quiet everything seemed. Even the hum of the life support system sounded muffled and strange. Station Commander Zilth waited for him near the docking bay doors. The Vorthak officer stood nearly 8 feet tall, his gray skin looking like old leather stretched over sharp bones. His forearms moved in the formal greeting pattern of his species, but his black eyes held no warmth. "Ambassador Kethavar," Zilth said in his flat, emotionless voice. "Welcome to Research Station Omega-7. We are honored by your visit." Kethavar nodded and tried to smile, though he knew the Vorthak would not understand the gesture. His own people were traders and diplomats by nature. They believed in building bridges between species and finding common ground. But the Vorthak had always been different. They saw everything as data to be collected and studied. "Thank you, Commander Zilth. The Galactic Council sends its regards. I trust this inspection will go smoothly." "Of course," Zilth replied. "We have nothing to hide. Our research here benefits all species in the galaxy." They began walking down a long corridor lined with observation windows. Through the clear material, Kethavar could see laboratory spaces filled with strange equipment. Scientists in white coats moved between tables covered with instruments he did not recognize. Everything looked clean and organized, but something felt wrong. "What kind of research do you conduct here?" Kethavar asked, trying to sound casual. "Behavioral studies," Zilth answered without looking at him. "We examine how different species react to various stimuli: fear, pain, stress, isolation. The data helps us understand the mental weaknesses of our enemies." The words made Kethavar's stomach turn. His people had fought wars long ago, but they had learned that violence only led to more violence. They had chosen a different path, one of peace and understanding. But the Vorthak still thought like warriors, even in their science. They passed through several more corridors, each one looking much like the last. The tour felt rehearsed, as if Zilth had given it many times before. He showed Kethavar the main laboratories, the data processing centers, and the staff quarters. Everything seemed normal, if coldly efficient, but Kethavar began to notice things that bothered him. Certain corridors were blocked off with heavy security doors. When he asked about them, Zilth would change the subject or give vague answers about classified research areas. The blocked passages had warning signs in several languages, including some that Kethavar recognized as warnings about dangerous materials or procedures. As they walked, Kethavar became aware of sounds that seemed out of place. His people had excellent hearing, much better than most species. At first he thought the noises were just the normal sounds of a research station: machinery, ventilation systems, the movement of staff. But as they continued the tour, he began to pick out sounds that made no sense. There were voices, soft voices that seemed to be calling out. The sounds were faint and seemed to come from the blocked-off areas that Zilth refused to discuss. Kethavar tried to focus on them, to understand what he was hearing. His universal translator worked differently than most. Instead of just converting words, it picked up emotional content and meaning. It helped him understand not just what beings were saying, but how they felt when they said it. It was a useful tool for a diplomat, helping him navigate the complex emotions of interspecies negotiations. But now his translator was picking up something that made his blood run cold. The voices he was hearing were filled with fear, deep, terrible fear mixed with sadness and pain. And there was something else, something that made him stop walking entirely. The voices were young, very young. "Is everything all right, Ambassador?" Zilth asked, noticing that his guest had stopped moving. Kethavar forced himself to start walking again. "Yes, of course. I was just admiring your security systems." But his mind was racing. Young voices filled with fear and pain coming from the areas that Zilth would not show him. What kind of research required such security? And why were there children involved? They continued the tour, visiting the dining areas and recreation facilities for the staff. The Vorthak who worked on the station moved through their duties with the same cold efficiency as their commander. None of them spoke unless spoken to, and when they did, their words were clipped and professional. Kethvar tried to listen for the voices again, but the sounds seemed to come and go. Sometimes he thought he heard crying, soft and heartbroken. Other times he heard what sounded like calls for help, though the words were too faint for his translator to pick up clearly. As they passed near another secured corridor, the sounds became stronger. His translator began to work on the emotional content, and what it told him made him feel sick. The fear he was detecting was not just any fear. It was the specific, desperate fear of children who had been separated from their parents. Children who were lost, alone, and terrified. "Commander," Kethvar said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what kind of specimens do you study here?" Zilth's black eyes fixed on him for a moment before looking away. "Various species, mostly lower forms of life, some more advanced subjects, when required for specific research goals. Advanced subjects? Sapient species, when we need to understand higher brain functions and emotional responses." The casual way Zilth said this made Kethvar's skin crawl. Sapient species meant intelligent beings, people. And if there were children involved, might I ask which sapient species you currently have under study? For the first time during the tour, Zilth hesitated, his four hands clasped together in what Kethvar recognized as a nervous gesture among the Vorthak. "Several species," Zilth finally said. "The research is classified by the Military Science Division. I am not authorized to discuss specific details." They had reached the end of the public areas of the station. Zilth began to lead them back toward the docking bay, clearly intending to end the tour. But as they passed near the largest of the secured areas, Kethvar heard something that stopped his heart. A child was crying. Not just any child, but a human child. His translator was working on the emotional content of the sounds, and it was telling him things that filled him with horror. The child was not just sad or scared. The child was in despair. The kind of deep, soul-crushing despair that came from being abandoned and alone for a very long time. Humans were a relatively new species to the galactic community. They had only made contact with other worlds in the last 50 years. Kethvar had met a few human diplomats and traders, and had found them to be emotional and passionate, but also surprisingly resilient. They formed strong bonds with their families, and especially with their children. The idea that human children might be locked away in this cold research station, separated from their parents and subjected to whatever experiments the Vorthak conducted, filled him with a rage he had never felt before. "Commander," Kethvar said, his voice carefully controlled, "I believe I heard some distress calls from that secured area. Perhaps we should investigate." "That is not possible," Zilth replied quickly. "Those areas are restricted. The research conducted there is vital to galactic security." "I am a diplomatic representative of the Galactic Council," Kethvar said, his voice growing firmer. "I have the authority to investigate any area of this station that might pose a threat to interspecies relations." "The research poses no such threat," Zilth said, but his nervous hand-clasping was becoming more pronounced. "I assure you, Ambassador, everything we do here is within the bounds of galactic law." As they argued, the crying grew louder. Now Kethvar could hear multiple voices. His translator was working frantically, picking up emotions and fragmentary words, fear, loneliness, pain, and underneath it all, calls for parents who were not there. "Mama," his translator whispered to him in his own language. "Papa, help us, please help us." The words hit him like physical blows. These were babies. Human babies, locked away in cages like animals. His own people treasured children above all things. The idea of deliberately causing harm to a child was so alien to his thinking that he could barely process what he was hearing. "I must insist on seeing those areas," Kethvar said, his diplomatic training warring with his growing anger. That is not possible, Zilth repeated. I suggest you complete your report based on what you have seen and return to your ship. But Kethavar was no longer listening to the Vorthak commander. His enhanced hearing was picking up more sounds from the secured areas. Footsteps, heavy footsteps of adults moving around, the sound of metal doors opening and closing, and underneath it all the constant background noise of children crying. How many were there? How long had they been here? Where were their parents? As these questions raced through his mind, Kethavar realized that his view of the galaxy had just changed forever. He had always believed that despite their differences, all sapient species shared certain basic values. The protection of children was supposed to be one of those universal values. But the Vorthak were keeping human children as test subjects. They were experimenting on babies. The tour was ending, but Kethavar's real work was just beginning. He had to find a way to get into those secured areas. He had to see for himself what was happening to those children. And if his worst fears were true, he had to find a way to help them. As they walked back toward his ship, the sounds grew fainter, but they never completely disappeared. Even when they reached the docking bay, he could still hear the faint echoes of children crying in the distance. Thank you for the tour, Commander, Kethavar said, forcing himself to sound calm and professional. I will prepare my report for the Council. Excellent, Zilth replied. I trust you found everything satisfactory. Kethavar looked into the Vorthak's black eyes and saw nothing there. No compassion, no guilt, no recognition that anything might be wrong. To Zilth, this was just another day at the research station. Yes, Kethavar lied. Everything was exactly as I expected. But as he walked up the ramp to his ship, he was already planning his return. Those children were not going to spend another night in this place if he could help it. The Vorthak had made a terrible mistake, and they did not even know it yet. The sound of crying children followed him all the way to his ship, and he knew it would haunt him until he found a way to silence it forever. Kethavar sat in his small ship for 3 hours, staring at the research station through his viewing port. His hands shook as he tried to drink his evening tea, but the liquid tasted like metal and despair. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard those voices again. The crying, the calls for parents who would never come. He had filed a preliminary report with the Galactic Council, keeping it vague and professional, but inside, his thoughts were spinning like a storm. He needed proof. He needed to see what was really happening in those secured areas. And he needed to do it without getting himself killed or imprisoned. The Vorthak had always been careful about following the letter of galactic law, even when they twisted its spirit beyond recognition. As a diplomatic representative, Kethavar had certain rights and protections, but those rights had limits, especially when it came to classified military research. He activated his communication system and sent a message to Station Commander Zilth. His diplomatic credentials gave him the right to request an extended stay for additional observations. It was a common practice when preparing detailed reports for the Council. Commander Zilth, he said into the transmitter, keeping his voice calm and professional. I have been reviewing my notes from today's tour, and I believe I need additional time to complete a thorough report. I would like to request guest quarters on the station for 3 days. The response came back quickly. Of course, Ambassador. We would be honored to host you. Quarters will be prepared immediately. Kethavar smiled grimly. The Vorthak were many things, but they were not stupid. Refusing a diplomatic request without good reason would raise questions they did not want to answer. They would give him quarters, and probably assign someone to watch him, but they would follow protocol. An hour later, he was back on the station, this time with a small bag of personal items and his diplomatic equipment. The quarters they gave him were comfortable but isolated, in a section of the station far from the main research areas. The walls were thick, and he suspected they were designed to block sound as much as to provide privacy. A young Vorthak officer, named Kextar, was assigned as his liaison. The officer was polite and helpful, offering to show Kethavar to the dining areas and recreation facilities. But Kethavar noticed that whenever he tried to walk toward the secured areas, Kextar would find reasons to guide him in other directions. Perhaps you would like to see our library, Kextar would say. Or, the observation deck has excellent views of the nebula. always steering him away from where he wanted to go. That first night, Kethvar lay in his guest bed and listened. The my station was quieter at night, with most of the research staff off duty. But the background sounds were still there. The hum of machinery, the whisper of air through ventilation systems, and underneath it all, the faint sounds of distress that his enhanced hearing could pick up. He waited until the station's night cycle was at its deepest point, then quietly left his quarters. His diplomatic status gave him the right to move freely through public areas of the station, though he knew that if he was caught in restricted zones, that protection might not help him. The corridors were dimly lit during night hours, with only emergency lighting to guide the way. Kethvar moved slowly and carefully, his soft shoes making no sound on the metal floors. His people were naturally quiet when they chose to be, a trait that had served them well in their early days as traders moving through dangerous territory. He made his way toward the largest of the secured areas, the one where the sounds had been strongest during his tour. As he got closer, the emotional content his translator was picking up became more intense. Fear, sadness, and loneliness washed over him like waves. The security door was massive, made of reinforced metal with electronic locks and warning signs in multiple languages. But as Kethvar studied it, he noticed something interesting. The door had a small viewing window, probably intended for guards to look inside without opening the main entrance. The window was too high for him to reach normally, but there was a maintenance ladder attached to the wall nearby. Kethvar climbed carefully, trying not to make any noise. When he reached the level of the window, he peered through the thick, transparent material. What he saw made him grab the ladder to keep from falling. The room beyond was huge, filled with rows of small metal cages. Each cage was barely large enough for a person to lie down, with no furniture except a thin mattress and a waste bucket. And in those cages were children, human children, ranging in age from what looked like 5 years old to maybe 12. The children were thin, too thin. Their clothes were simple gray uniforms that hung loose on their small frames. Most of them were sleeping, curled up on their mattresses like frightened animals. But a few were awake, sitting in the corners of their cages with their arms wrapped around their knees. Kethvar counted the cages he could see. 20, 30. More disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the room, each one containing a human child who should have been at home with their families, playing and learning, and growing up safe. One of the children, a girl who looked to be about 8 years old, was awake and staring at the viewing window. For a moment, their eyes met through the thick glass. The child's face was pale and hollow, her eyes far too old for someone so young. She raised one small hand and pressed it against the cage bars, as if reaching toward him. Kethvar had to close his eyes and take deep breaths to keep from being sick. When he looked again, the girl was still watching him. Tears were running down her face, but she made no sound. Even in her despair, she had learned to be quiet. The ambassador climbed down from the ladder on shaking legs. His mind was reeling from what he had seen. This was not research, this was not even cruel experimentation. This was torture. The systematic torture of children for no purpose he could understand. He needed to see more. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening here. Moving as quietly as he could, Kethvar made his way to another secured area. This one was smaller, and the viewing window was at ground level. Through this window, he could see what appeared to be a medical examination room. There were tables with restraints, cabinets full of instruments, and machines whose purpose he could only guess at. On one of the tables, a small human boy was strapped down while a Vorthak scientist attached electrodes to his head. The boy was conscious and terrified. He was trying to say something, but the restraints around his head made it difficult to speak clearly. Kethvar's translator picked up fragments of words. Please and mama and hurts repeated over and over. The Vorthak scientist was making notes on a datapad, completely ignoring the child's distress. To the scientist, this was just another test subject. The boy's fear and pain were simply data, points to be recorded and analyzed. Kethvar forced himself to watch, burning every detail into his memory. This was evidence. This was proof of what the Vorthak were doing. But proof of what, exactly? What was the purpose of all this cruelty? He found his answer at the third viewing window. This room was set up like a conference area, with a large display, screen, and several chairs arranged around a table. Dr. Vextal, the lead researcher he had met briefly during his tour, was presenting data to a group of Vorthak officers. The sound was muffled by the thick walls, but Kethvar could make out most of what was being said. The human fear response is significantly stronger than any other species we have tested, Dr. Vextal was saying, using a pointer to indicate charts and graphs on the display. Their emotional volatility makes them ideal subjects for psychological warfare research. One of the officers asked a question that Kethvar could not quite hear. We selected juveniles because their fear responses are the purest, Dr. Vextal replied. Adult humans have learned to control their emotions to some degree, but the young ones provide unfiltered data. Their terror is complete and honest. Another officer spoke up. How were the subjects acquired? Dr. Vextal's response made Kethvar's blood run cold. Colony ship Neptune 7 suffered an unfortunate accident while traveling through the Vortex Nebula. Engine failure, life support systems damaged. We were able to rescue some of the passengers before the ship was lost. It was a lie. Kethvar was certain of it. The way Dr. Vextal spoke, the casual tone he used when describing a rescue operation, it was too convenient, too clean. The Vorthak had attacked the colony ship. They had deliberately targeted a vessel carrying families, children. The adult subjects proved less useful and were disposed of, Dr. Vextal continued. But the juveniles have provided months of valuable data. Their capacity for sustained fear is remarkable. Disposed of. The words echoed in Kethvar's mind. These children were not just prisoners. They were orphans. The Vorthak had murdered their parents and kept the children as test subjects. The meeting continued, with the officers discussing plans to acquire more subjects from other human colony ships. They talked about the children like they were laboratory equipment, discussing their fear responses and pain thresholds as if they were describing the specifications of a machine. Kethvar had heard enough. He quietly made his way back to his quarters, his mind racing with horror and rage. He had diplomatic immunity, but that would not protect him if he was caught spying on classified military research. And it certainly would not help the children if he was arrested or expelled from the station. He needed help. He needed someone with the authority to stop this madness. But who would believe him? And even if they did believe him, who would be willing to act against the Vorthak Military Science Division? As he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, Kethvar thought about the little girl who had pressed her hand against the cage bars. She had looked at him with such hope in her eyes, as if she thought he might be able to help her, as if she still believed that somewhere in the universe there were adults who cared about what happened to children. He could not let her down. He could not let any of them down. But as he tried to formulate a plan, he kept coming back to the same terrible realization. The children were human, but humanity was still a minor species in the galactic community. They had few allies and little political power. Even if he could prove what was happening here, would anyone care enough to risk conflict with the powerful Vorthak military? The sounds of crying drifted through the station's ventilation system, so faint that only his enhanced hearing could detect them. Somewhere in the darkness, dozens of human children were lying in cold metal cages, calling for parents who would never answer. Kethvar closed his eyes and made a promise to those children. He would find a way to help them. He would find a way to make someone care. He had no idea that his promise would soon ignite a fire that would burn across the galaxy. The next morning, Kethvar requested an immediate meeting with Station Commander Zilth. He had spent the remaining hours of the night preparing his approach, choosing his words carefully. This had to be done right. One chance was all he would get. Zilth received him in his office, a cold room decorated with military honors and weapons from various worlds the Vorthak had conquered over the centuries. The commander sat behind his massive desk, his forearms arranged in a pose that suggested both authority and barely contained violence. "Ambassador," Zilth said in his flat voice, "I trust you slept well in our guest quarters." "Well enough," Kethvar replied, taking the seat across from the desk. "Though I must confess I found some aspects of your station quite disturbing." Zilth's black eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. Oh? In what way? Kethavar had decided that direct confrontation would be his best approach. The Vorthak respected strength and despised what they saw as weakness or deception. If he tried to be subtle or diplomatic, they would simply dismiss him as another soft-hearted alien who did not understand the realities of galactic politics. "I know about the human children," he said simply. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. Zilth's four hands remained perfectly still on his desk, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ambassador." "Don't insult my intelligence, Commander. I've seen the containment areas. I've seen the children, in cages. I've seen your scientists conducting experiments on them." Zilth leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since Kethavar had met him, the Vorthak commander smiled. It was not a pleasant expression on his alien features. "Have you indeed? How fascinating. And tell me, Ambassador, what exactly do you think you saw?" "I saw children. Human children who should be with their families locked in cages like animals. I saw scientists torturing them for research purposes. I saw evidence of war crimes that would shock the entire Galactic Council." "War crimes?" Zilth's smile widened. "Against whom?" "The humans are not full members of the galactic community. They have no formal treaties, no established rights under galactic law. They are classified as a developing species under the protection of the Council, but that protection has significant limitations." Kethavar felt his heart sink. He had feared this argument, but had hoped it would not come to it. The humans were, indeed, still in the process of establishing their place in galactic society. Their colonies were scattered and poorly defended. Their government was fragmented and politically weak. "Children are children," Kethavar said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Regardless of species, regardless of political status. What you're doing here is wrong." "According to whom?" Zilth asked, his tone becoming more confident. "Your people? Your soft, trade-focused culture that has never had to make the hard decisions required for galactic security? You've spent so long hiding behind stronger species that you've forgotten what real strength looks like." The insult stung, but Kethavar pushed past it. "I'm invoking my authority as a representative of the Galactic Council. I demand that you immediately release those children and return them to human space." Zilth's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "You demand? You, representing a species of merchants and diplomats, demand that the Vorthak Military Science Division abandon critical research? Do you have any idea how valuable the data we've collected is?" "I don't care about your data. I care about those children." "Of course you do," Zilth said, his voice dripping with contempt. "That's exactly the kind of emotional thinking that makes species like yours weak. You see a few crying youngsters and immediately want to abandon research that could save millions of lives." "Save lives? You're torturing children." "We're gathering intelligence on the psychological weaknesses of a potentially hostile species," Zilth corrected. "Humans are unpredictable, violent, and expansionist. They reproduce rapidly and show little respect for established galactic authority. Do you really think they'll remain peaceful forever?" Kethavar stared at the commander in disbelief. "So you justify torturing their children by claiming they might someday become a threat?" "I justify necessary research by pointing out that they're already a threat. Do you know how humans react when their territory is threatened? They don't negotiate or retreat like civilized species. They fight. They fight with a ferocity that defies logic, and they never surrender. That doesn't give you the right to kidnap and torture their young, doesn't it?" Zilth stood up and walked to one of the weapons mounted on his wall, a curved blade from some long-dead world. "Let me tell you something about humans, Ambassador. Something your peaceful people might not understand. They're not like us. They're not civilized in the way we define civilization." He turned back to face Kethavar, the weapon still in his hands. "Humans are predators. They evolved from pack hunters on a death world that tried to kill them every day for millions of years. They learned to be killers before they learned to be thinkers. And now they're spreading across the galaxy, building colonies and expanding their territory. Every species expands when they develop space travel. That's natural. But not every species builds their colonies the way humans do. Have you seen their settlements, Ambassador? They don't just build cities and research stations. They build fortresses. Every human colony is designed to be defended, even the ones that are supposed to be peaceful trading posts. Zilth placed the weapon back on its mount and returned to his desk. And their military technology is advancing faster than their diplomatic capabilities. They're developing weapons and defense systems that could challenge even the older galactic powers. So you decided to steal their children and torture them for information. We decided to study their psychological weaknesses before they become a real threat, Zilth corrected. The research we're conducting here could prevent a war that would consume half the galaxy. Kethvar leaned forward in his chair. Commander, you need to understand something. You're not preventing a war. You're starting one. For the first time, Zilth looked uncertain. What do you mean? I mean that humans are not like other species when it comes to their young. They don't just love their children, they're obsessed with protecting them. It's built into their psychology at the deepest level. Take their children and you don't just make them angry, you make them into something else entirely. They're weak, Zilth said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. We've tested them. They break easily under pressure. You've tested individual children separated from their families and communities, Kethvar said. That tells you nothing about what humans become when you threaten their young as a species. He stood up and walked to the window that looked out onto the research areas of the station. Commander, I've studied the historical records of every species in the galactic community. I know their war patterns, their cultural responses to threats, their breaking points. And I'm telling you that what you're doing here will have consequences you can't imagine. You're exaggerating. Am I? Kethvar turned back to face the Vorthak commander. Let me ask you something. How did you acquire those children? Zilth hesitated. That's classified. You attacked a colony ship. You murdered the adults and took the children. Do you really think the humans don't know that ship is missing? Do you think they haven't been looking for it? Even if they have, there's no evidence linking us to its disappearance. There is now, Kethvar said quietly, because I've seen those children. And I'm going to report what I've seen to the Galactic Council. The threat hung in the air between them. Zilth's 4 hands clenched into fists, and his black eyes filled with a cold fury that promised violence. I don't think you are, Ambassador. Are you threatening a diplomatic representative of the Galactic Council? I'm pointing out that your report would be based on observations of classified military research. Such a report would constitute an act of espionage which would void your diplomatic immunity. Kethvar smiled grimly. Then I guess we have a problem, don't we? They stared at each other across the desk, 2 representatives of vastly different philosophies locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Zilth spoke. What do you want? I want those children released immediately. I want them returned to human space with full medical care and psychological support. And I want your word that no more human colony ships will suffer unfortunate accidents. That's not possible. Then I'll file my report with the council and let them decide what to do about it. Zilth's laugh was bitter. You still don't understand, do you? The council won't act against us. They're too afraid of Vorthak military power, and the humans are too weak to do anything about it themselves. You're wrong about the humans, Kethvar said softly. And you're about to learn just how wrong you are. Is that a threat? It's a warning. Release those children, Commander. Release them now, while you still can. Or what? Kethvar looked out the window again, toward the secured areas where dozens of human children were caged like animals. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. You caged human children. Commander, do you even realize, my God, what have you done? Zilth's expression was one of complete dismissal. I've conducted necessary research for the security of the galaxy. No, Kethvar said, turning to face him one last time. You've made the worst mistake any species can make. You've threatened the young of a species that will burn the galaxy to ash before they let harm come to their children. You're being dramatic. Am I? We'll see. Kethvar walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. I'm leaving this station in 1 hour, Commander. If those children aren't released by the time I reach my ship, then everything that happens after that is on your head. They won't be released, Zilth said flatly. And nothing is going to happen. Humans are weak, Ambassador. They'll file a complaint with the Council and be ignored just like always. Kethvar opened the door and stepped into the corridor. You keep telling yourself that, Commander, right up until the moment their ships arrive. As he walked away, he heard Zilth's voice calling after him. What ships? They don't even know where their children are. But Kethvar didn't answer. He was already thinking about the message he would send as soon as he reached his ship. A message that would travel through quantum communication networks to every human colony and outpost in known space. A message that would tell them exactly where their stolen children were being held. The Vorthak had always been good at making war, but they had never faced an enemy fighting to protect their young. They were about to learn the difference. Kethvar's message went out 6 hours after he left Research Station Omega-7. It was not sent through official diplomatic channels, which would have taken days to process and might have been blocked by political considerations. Instead, he used an old traders network, a system of communication relays that connected merchant ships and trading posts across the galaxy. The message was simple and direct. He included the exact coordinates of the research station, a detailed description of what he had seen, and his own diplomatic credentials as verification. Most importantly, he included recordings his enhanced hearing had made of the children's voices, their calls for help translated into human languages. The first human ship to receive the message was a small cargo hauler called the Dancing Star, carrying agricultural supplies to a colony world 3 systems away. Captain Marcus Webb was a quiet man who had spent most of his adult life moving freight between the scattered human settlements. He had 2 daughters of his own back on Earth, and when he heard those children's voices calling for their parents, something broke inside him. Webb immediately forwarded the message to every human ship and station in his communication range, then changed course toward the coordinates Kethvar had provided. His cargo hauler was not a warship. It had no weapons, except a small plasma cutter used for asteroid mining. But Captain Webb was no longer thinking about the odds against him. The second ship to receive the message was the New Horizon, a colony transport carrying 300 families to establish a new settlement in the Outer Rim. Captain Sarah Chen had been in command of human vessels for 15 years and had fought in the small conflicts that had marked humanity's expansion into space. When she heard the recordings of the children, she made a decision that would be remembered for centuries. All stop, she ordered her navigation officer. Send a message to every human ship within 50 light years. Tell them we have found our missing children and we're going to bring them home. Captain, her first officer said quietly, we're a civilian transport. We have families on board. This isn't our fight. Chen turned to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him step back. Those children in those cages, they are our families. Every human child is our family. Send the message. Within 12 hours, every human ship within range was changing course toward Research Station Omega-7. Colony ships left their planned routes. Cargo haulers abandoned their deliveries. Even passenger liners carrying tourists diverted from their destinations. The response was not coordinated by any government or military command. It was purely instinctive, driven by something deeper than politics or strategy. The human children were calling for help, and every human who heard that call was coming to answer it. Commander Zilth first became aware that something was wrong when his long-range sensors detected ships approaching from multiple directions. The signatures were diverse, everything from small personal craft to massive colony transports, but they were all moving toward his station with single-minded determination. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving demands for surrender from 47 different vessels. They're all human. Zilth studied the tactical display showing the approaching ships. There were too many of them, coming from too many directions. His station's defenses were designed to handle a few attackers, not a coordinated assault by an entire fleet. How did they find us, he asked. Unknown, sir. But they seem to know exactly what we're doing here. They're demanding the immediate release of all human prisoners. Zilth activated his command console and sent an emergency message to Vorthak High Command. This is Research Station Omega-7. We are under threat of attack by human forces. Request immediate military support. The response came back within minutes. Support will arrive in 72 hours. Maintain station security until relieved. 72 hours. Zilth looked at the tactical display again. The human ships would arrive in less than 6 hours. Sir, his weapons officer called out, we're detecting some unusual modifications on those human vessels. They appear to be mounting heavy weapons on civilian ships. What kind of weapons? Mining lasers, industrial cutters, even construction equipment that's been converted into kinetic weapons. It's like they're turning everything they have into a weapon. Zilth frowned. The approaching human fleet was not a military force. It was a collection of civilian ships whose crews had decided to turn themselves into warriors. It was chaotic, disorganized, and completely unpredictable. It was also terrifying. As the hours passed, more human ships continued to arrive. Some came alone, others in small groups. A few were clearly military vessels, destroyers and frigates from the human defense forces, but most were civilian craft that had been hastily armed with whatever weapons their crews could find. Dr. Vextal appeared on the command deck as the first human ships came within weapons range. Commander, we need to evacuate the research data immediately. The psychological profiles we've developed are invaluable. What about the test subjects? Zilth asked. They're expendable. The data is what matters. Before Zilth could respond, his communications officer interrupted. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the lead human vessel. They want to speak with you directly. Put it through. The main screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of what appeared to be a converted cargo hauler. A human woman in a captain's uniform stared out at him with eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. I am Captain Sarah Chen of the Human. Vessel New Horizon, she said in a voice that was perfectly calm and completely terrifying. You have something that belongs to us. I am Station Commander Zilth of the Vorthak Military Science Division, he replied, trying to project authority. You are in violation of galactic law by threatening a military research facility. Galactic law? Chen's voice took on a tone of bitter amusement. You want to talk about galactic law? Let's talk about the law that says you don't steal children from their families. Let's talk about the law that says you don't torture babies for research data. Those subjects are legally acquired specimens under military research protocols. Those subjects are human children, and you're going to give them back to us. Now. Zilth straightened in his command chair. I refuse. This research is vital to galactic security. I will not allow emotional sentimentality to interfere with necessary military objectives. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. I see. Well, Commander, let me explain something to you about human military objectives. We have exactly one. Protect our young. Everything else is negotiable. You're outnumbered and outgunned, Zilth said. This station has military-grade weapons and shields. Your civilian ships won't last 5 minutes against our defenses. You're probably right, Chen agreed. A lot of us are going to die in the next few hours. But here's the thing you don't understand about humans, Commander. We're not trying to win. We're just trying to make sure our children don't spend another night in your cages. The transmission ended, leaving Zilth staring at a blank screen. Around him, his bridge crew prepared for battle with the efficiency of trained military personnel. But there was something in their movements, a hesitation that he had never seen before. Sir, his tactical officer said quietly, there are now over 80 human vessels in attack formation. More are arriving every few minutes. From where? How are so many human ships reaching us so quickly? It appears they're using some kind of emergency communication network. They're calling in every human vessel within range, regardless of their original mission. Through the viewing ports, Zilth could see the lights of the approaching human fleet. They didn't move in the precise formations of trained military units. Instead, they swarmed toward the station like angry insects, each ship following its own path but all focused on the same target. Sir, his communications officer said, we're receiving transmissions from some of the human vessels. They're They're talking to each other on open channels. What are they saying? They're sharing information about their families, sir. Talking about their own children. Some of them are reading letters from home or showing pictures of their kids to their crewmates. Zilth felt a chill run down his spine. Military units didn't behave this way before battle. They maintained communication discipline and focused on tactical objectives. But these humans were treating the approaching battle as something personal, something that went beyond military duty. "Commander," Dr. Vextal said urgently, "we need to begin destroying the research data and eliminating the test subjects. If the humans capture the station, eliminating the subjects?" Zilth looked at the scientist with something like shock. "You mean killing the children?" "They're just test subjects, Commander. And if the humans recover them alive, they'll have proof of our research methods." For the first time since this crisis began, Zilth hesitated. He had ordered the deaths of enemy soldiers and even civilian populations when military necessity demanded it. But the idea of deliberately murdering children, even enemy children, seemed to cross a line he hadn't known existed. His hesitation was interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire station. The human ships had opened fire. "Shields at 80%, his tactical officer reported. "Multiple impacts from mining lasers and kinetic projectiles." "Return fire," Zilth ordered. "Target the largest vessels first." The station's defense weapons came online, sending beams of coherent energy toward the approaching human fleet. The first shots found their targets and 2 human ships exploded in balls of superheated plasma. But instead of retreating, the remaining ships pressed their attack even harder. "Sir, the humans are not following standard combat tactics," his tactical officer reported. "They're making individual attack runs with no apparent coordination. It's like each ship is fighting its own separate battle." Another explosion rocked the station. Then another. The human ships were attacking with complete disregard for their own safety, flying straight through the station's defensive fire to get close enough for their improvised weapons to be effective. "Shields at 60%, came the report. Multiple hull breaches on levels 7 through 12. Through the chaos of battle, Zilth began to understand something that chilled him to his core. These humans weren't fighting a war. They were fighting something much more dangerous. They were fighting as parents whose children were in danger, and that made them capable of things that no rational military force would attempt. A small human fighter, probably a converted civilian shuttle, came screaming past the main viewing port. Its hull was torn open and atmosphere was venting into space, but its pilot was still firing everything he had at the station's weapons arrays. "Sir," his communications officer said, "that fighter's pilot is broadcasting on all frequencies. He's saying he has a daughter the same age as the children we're holding." The fighter exploded against one of the station's weapon turrets, taking the defensive position with it. The pilot had deliberately crashed his ship into the station, sacrificing his life to improve the chances for the other human vessels, and he wasn't the only one. Across the battle zone, human pilots were making similar choices. When their weapons ran out, they used their ships as guided missiles. When their ships were too damaged to continue fighting, they rammed the station's defensive positions. "This is insane," Dr. Vextal said, watching the battle through the command center's viewing ports. "They're committing suicide for a handful of test subjects." But Zilth was beginning to understand that the humans saw this very differently. To them, those weren't test subjects in the station's cages. They were children, human children, and apparently humans would literally die before they allowed harm to come to their young. "Sir, shields are down to 30%, his tactical officer reported. "At this rate, they'll breach the station's hull within the hour." Zilth looked at the tactical display, showing the positions of the attacking human ships. There were fewer of them now. His station's defenses had taken a heavy toll, but the survivors were fighting with even greater intensity, as if the death of their comrades had only made them more determined. He thought about Dr. Vextal's suggestion to eliminate the test subjects. It would be the logical military decision. Destroy the evidence and deny the enemy their objective. But as he watched human pilots sacrifice their lives to reach those children, Zilth began to wonder if logic was the right approach here. These humans were showing him something he had never seen before. They were demonstrating a level of commitment that went beyond military training or political loyalty. They were fighting with the desperate fury of parents protecting their young, and that made them more dangerous than any army he had ever faced. The battle was far from over, but Zilth already knew how it would end. The humans would keep coming, until either they were all dead or they had their children back. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, no compromise. And for the first time in his military career, Commander Zilth was afraid. The battle for Research Station Omega-7 lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. When it ended, 43 human vessels had been destroyed, and over 800 humans were dead. But the station's shields were down, its weapons were silent, and human soldiers were moving through its corridors with grim determination. Commander Zilth sat in his command chair, watching the tactical display as the human boarding party secured section after section of his station. His own forces had fought well, but they were outnumbered and facing an enemy that seemed to feel no fear of death. The humans moved through the station like nothing he had ever seen before. They didn't advance with the careful tactics of trained soldiers. Instead, they flowed through the corridors like water finding the lowest point, always moving toward the areas where the children were held. Every human on the station seemed to know exactly where they needed to go, as if they could somehow sense the location of the cages. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "the human commander is requesting permission to come to the bridge." Zilth looked around at what remained of his bridge crew. Half of them were dead or wounded, and the survivors looked defeated. The station's defenses were gone, its weapons destroyed, its hull breached in dozens of places. There was nothing left to fight with. "Grant permission," he said. The bridge doors opened and Captain Sarah Chen walked in. She was wearing a pressure suit that was scorched and torn from the battle, and she carried a human military rifle that looked like it had been through hell. But her eyes were calm and focused, and when she looked at Zilth, he saw something there that made him understand why his forces had lost. She wasn't looking at him like an enemy commander who had been defeated in battle. She was looking at him like someone who had threatened her children. "Commander Zilth," she said in that same perfectly calm voice he had heard hours earlier, "I want you to understand something before we proceed. This wasn't a battle. This was a rescue mission. The only reason you're still alive is because dead men can't open cages." Behind her, more humans entered the bridge. They weren't all soldiers. Some were wearing the uniforms of cargo ship crews, others the work clothes of miners and construction workers. A few were even dressed in civilian clothing that suggested they had been passengers on ships that had diverted to join the rescue mission. But every one of them was armed, and every one of them was looking at the Vorthak bridge crew with the same cold fury that burned in their captain's eyes. "You want your research subjects," Zilth said, trying to maintain some dignity in defeat. "I understand. But you need to understand that what we were doing here was legitimate military research under galactic law." Chen stepped closer to his command chair, and Zilth could see his own reflection in her helmet visor. "Legitimate? You kidnapped children. You murdered their parents. You tortured babies for research data. What part of that sounds legitimate to you? The subjects were acquired during a legitimate rescue operation. Stop calling them subjects." The shout came from one of the humans behind Chen, a man wearing the uniform of a merchant ship captain. "They're children. They have names. They have families." Chen held up a hand and the man fell silent. But Zilth could see the same rage burning in all of their faces. These humans were barely maintaining control, and he began to understand that his life was hanging by a much thinner thread than he had realized. "My name is Captain Sarah Chen," she said, her voice returning to that terrifying calm. "I have a daughter named Emma who is 7 years old. She likes to draw pictures of spaceships and wants to be an explorer when she grows up. Every night, before I leave on a mission, I read her a story and tuck her into bed." She leaned closer to his chair. "One of the children you've been torturing is the same age as my Emma. So when I ask you where the keys to those cages are, I want you to understand that I'm not asking as a military officer or a representative of humanity's government. I'm asking as a mother whose child is crying in the dark." Zilth looked into her eyes and saw something that made his blood run cold. This human woman would kill him without hesitation if he gave her the slightest excuse. Not because of military necessity or political objectives, but because he had hurt children and she was a parent. The containment areas are managed by automated systems, he said quickly. Dr. Vextal has the access codes. Where is Dr. Vextal? He evacuated to the research lab when the battle started. Section 15, Level 7. Chen nodded to one of her soldiers who spoke into his communication device. Within minutes, reports were coming back from the human teams moving through the station. Captain, a voice said through the comm system, we've found the main containment area. There are... The voice paused, and when it continued, it was thick with emotion. There are 63 children here, Captain, ages 5 through 12. They're alive, but they're in bad shape. Chen closed her eyes for a moment, and Zilth could see her hands shaking with barely controlled rage. When she opened her eyes again, he saw something there that made him wish he could disappear. Are they asking for their parents? She asked, quietly. Yes, ma'am, they want to know if we're here to take them home. Tell them yes, Chen said, her voice breaking slightly. Tell them we're here to take them home. She turned back to Zilth, and now her voice was deadly quiet. 63 children. You kept 63 human children in cages for months. Do you have any idea what you've done? I conducted necessary research for galactic security, Zilth said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. No, Chen replied. You declared war on humanity. You just didn't realize it yet. Another voice came through the comm system. Captain, we've secured Dr. Vextal. You're going to want to see what we found in his lab. What did you find? Files, ma'am. Detailed records of everything they did to those kids. Test procedures, psychological profiles, pain threshold measurements, and... The voice hesitated. And what? Plans to acquire more subjects, ma'am. They were planning to attack another colony ship next month. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Chen's breathing inside her helmet. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Zilth had to strain to hear it. Bring Dr. Vextal to the bridge. Now. Within minutes, the Vorthak scientist was dragged onto the bridge by 2 human soldiers. His white lab coat was torn and stained, and his 4 arms were bound behind his back. When he saw Zilth, he began speaking rapidly in his native language. Speak standard, Chen ordered. I want to understand what you're saying. Dr. Vextal looked at her with the same cold detachment he had shown when discussing the children. I was telling the commander that the research data must be preserved. The psychological profiles we developed are invaluable for military applications. Chen stared at him for a long moment. You're proud of what you did to those children. I conducted groundbreaking research into human psychological weaknesses. The fear responses we documented will save countless Vorthak lives in future conflicts. Future conflicts? When humanity inevitably becomes aggressive and expansionist, we will be prepared. We understand their breaking points now. Chen turned to look at Zilth, then back at Dr. Vextal. You really don't understand what you've done, do you? I've advanced the science of psychological warfare by decades. No, Chen said quietly. You've shown the galaxy what happens when someone threatens human children. You've turned every human in known space into your enemy, and you've given them a reason to fight that goes deeper than politics or territory. She gestured to the humans around her. These people came from dozens of different ships, different colonies, different backgrounds. Most of them had never met before today. But when they heard those children crying, they dropped everything and came here to help. They didn't ask for orders from any government or military command. They just came. Dr. Vextal looked confused. That's irrational behavior. Military efficiency requires central command and coordination. It's not military efficiency, Chen replied. It's love. And love makes us do things that your research could never predict or understand. A new voice came through the comm system. Captain, we have all the children secured. Medical teams are treating them now. They're scared and malnourished, but they're all alive. Chen nodded, then looked back at the 2 Vorthak officers. Here's what's going to happen now. Dr. Vextal, you're going to provide us with every piece of research data you collected. Every file, every recording, every psychological profile. We want to know exactly what you did to those children so we can help them heal. That research is classified military intelligence. I will not. Chen's rifle came up so fast that Zilth barely saw her move. The weapon was pointed directly at Dr. Vextal's head and her finger was on the trigger. Let me explain something to you about human psychology, Doctor. When you threaten our children, we become capable of things that defy your understanding of rational behavior. Right now, I am perfectly willing to kill you for what you did to those babies. The only thing stopping me is the possibility that you might have information that could help them recover from the trauma you caused. Dr. Vextal's scientific detachment finally cracked. You can't kill me. I'm a prisoner of war. There are conventions. Conventions? Chen's laugh was bitter. You want to talk about attacked his family's colony ship. His parents died in the attack and he was taken to your station for your experiments. Dr. Vextal's eyes widened slightly. Subject designation H-47. Responded well to isolation stress protocols. The sound Chen made was barely human. His name was Tommy, and according to your files, you kept him in a cage for 4 months. You subjected him to fear conditioning, pain response testing, and psychological isolation. You recorded his cries for his dead parents and used them as data points in your research. She pressed the muzzle of her rifle against the scientist's forehead. Tommy died yesterday, Doctor. The medical team says his heart just gave out from the stress and malnutrition, but I think he died of a broken heart, calling for parents who were never going to come for him. The bridge was completely silent. Even the Vorthak officers were staring at Chen in shock. So when you ask me about conventions and proper treatment of prisoners, Chen continued, remember that you killed Tommy Morrison. You killed a little boy who just wanted to go home to his family. Dr. Vextal was shaking now, his scientific detachment completely gone. I was following research protocols. The subjects were necessary for their names, Chen said quietly. All of them. I want the names of every child you experimented on. I guess we didn't record names, only designation numbers. Chen's finger tightened on the trigger. Then you better hope someone else kept records, because if I can't tell their families what happened to them, you're not leaving this station alive. Captain, one of her soldiers said quietly, we found personnel records in the administrative section. They have the names of all the children from the colony ship. Chen nodded but didn't lower her weapon. Good. Make sure every family gets a full report of what happened here. They deserve to know the truth. She finally stepped back from Dr. Vextal, though her rifle remained trained on him. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a human prison, Doctor. And every day you're going to remember the names of the children you tortured. Every single one of them. She turned to Zilth. As for you, Commander, you're going to send a message to your superiors. You're going to tell them exactly what happened here. And you're going to explain why attacking human children was the worst mistake your species could have made. The Vorthak Empire will not negotiate with terrorists, Zilth said, trying to sound defiant. Terrorists? Chen's voice was filled with dark amusement. Commander, we're not terrorists. We're parents, and we're going to make sure that every species in the galaxy understands what happens when someone threatens human children. She gestured to her soldiers, who began securing the prisoners. You see, your research taught you about human psychological weaknesses. But you missed the most important thing about human psychology. We're not just individuals, we're a family. Every human child is our child. Every human parent is our parent. As the Vorthak officers were led away, Chen looked out through the bridge's viewing ports at the damaged human ships that surrounded the station. So many of them were gone, destroyed in the battle to rescue children they had never met. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. Captain, her communications officer said, we're receiving messages from human colonies across the sector. They're asking if we need additional support. Chen smiled for the first time since the battle began. Tell them we have our children back, but let them know that this is just the beginning. The galaxy needs to understand that humanity will go to any lengths to protect our young. As the rescued children were transferred to medical ships and the human fleet prepared to depart, Ambassador Kethvar watched from his diplomatic vessel. He had returned to witness the aftermath of the battle, and what he saw filled him with both admiration and terror. The humans had not fought like any military force he had ever studied. They had fought like parents protecting their children, and that had made them capable of things that defied all tactical understanding. They had turned civilian ships into weapons, sacrificed their lives without hesitation, and shown a level of unity that transcended government or military command. But most importantly, they had sent a message that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity was not just another species trying to find its place among the stars. They were protectors, guardians who would literally tear the universe apart before allowing harm to come to their young. As Kethvar watched the human ships disappear into hyperspace, carrying their rescued children home, he made a note in his diplomatic files. Other species would need to know what he had learned here. They would need to understand that humans were not weak or primitive, despite their youth as a spacefaring civilization. They were something far more dangerous than any warrior race or military empire. They were a species that had learned to love, and that love made them capable of things that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who threatened their families. The Vorthak had discovered what humans really were. Now it was time for the rest of the galaxy to learn the same lesson. Human children were not test subjects to be studied or specimens to be collected. They were the most precious thing in the universe to their species, and humanity would protect them with a fury that could burn stars from the sky. The galaxy would never be the same.